The Currie Surf Club is very attractive apparently this afternoon. It's too close a walk. I hear they're doing a booming business. Anyway, we're going to keep on time. We appreciate your delegates coming in to listen to this session. It's a very important session because it's actually, whilst it involves the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator and the National Transport Commission, you need to understand that both of these organisations are actually funded by each state government and the federal government to undertake their task. And their role largely is to address heavy vehicle regulation issues and heavy vehicle reform issues and look at how we get a national and consistent approach to reform and regulation within our industry. So a lot of people seem to think that this doesn't have much to do with state governments or territory governments, when in fact the impact of these two organisations on your business and on how your state departments of transport and your state regulators regulate you, or the types of issues they might look at in the context of bus reform, will flow through to your businesses at a very direct basis. And we work very closely with our state associations to make sure that they're on the ground in your states, actually ensuring that the national reform and national regulatory regime is understood and that the industry's view is a coordinated one that's presented to state, territory and the federal government. So our first speaker today is Jeff Potter. Jeff is the Project Director of Productivity, Safety and Environment at the National Transport Commission. He's involved currently with a heavy vehicle roadworthiness project, which will be looking at roadworthiness standards, frequency of roadworthiness inspections, and that will ultimately see a national approach which will impact on each of your operations every day in the context of your accreditation requirements and the vehicle inspections requirements. So having said that, I'll ask Jeff Potter to the podium.
Right, thanks very much, Michael, and thanks particularly for the invitation to come and speak to you today. It's very rare to get the opportunity to have national representation from all of the states across an industry in the room at one time. As Michael said, the project that's occupying most of my time at the moment, and a very important one for the National Transport Commission, is looking at a review of heavy vehicle roadworthiness that's been undertaken jointly with the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator. This project really was given its impetus after the Coots fuel tanker crash in Mona Vale in New South Wales almost a year ago. And at that stage, ministers asked the National Transport Commission to bring forward some work that was on our work program for next year on looking at what the inspection regimes around Australia are for roadworthiness of heavy vehicles, and at the same time asked the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator to accelerate the work that they had planned to do on reviewing the National Heavy Vehicle Accreditation Scheme, particularly in relation to the maintenance management aspect of it. I'm not going to talk very much about the review of accreditation this afternoon because that's very much a scheme that's of most interest to road freight vehicles rather than to buses, and every state and territory have their own accreditation or equivalent to accreditation requirements that buses need to comply with. But the overall outcome that we're looking for with this project is to take the range of different practices that are in place around Australia in terms of the requirements for vehicles to be maintained in a roadworthy condition, in terms of the inspection and testing regimes that are in place in the various jurisdictions, and the different compliance regimes, including roadside enforcement, that are undertaken to detect and deter defective vehicles, and develop a nationally applicable scheme that is going to raise the level of roadworthiness across the heavy vehicle fleet as a whole. So there are a few elements that we started as needing to deal with that. One's nationally consistent standards and approaches. We discovered very early on that every state does everything differently in this space for heavy vehicles. Now, that's not a great surprise. On most subject areas, when we come to look at what the states and territories are doing, we find that everyone does everything differently. The complication in this case was they did it differently, but they called it all by the same name. And so getting some sort of reasonable basis for comparison of the number of defects found in vehicles where the roadside inspection is done with a roller shaker trailer and some fairly sophisticated electronics versus the level of defects when the roadside inspection is done by two men with a torch and a tape measure, that they're not detecting the same sorts of things and they aren't really comparable. We're looking at the most effective use of accreditation schemes and of the elements of accreditation schemes, really starting from the question of if your accreditation scheme has requirements there that say this is what we require you to do to keep your vehicle in good roadworthy condition, why aren't we asking everybody to do that? And if it's not the right thing, how do we change it so that it is? Looking at the legislative provisions, the procedures, the operational provisions, and making sure that they're properly designed, they're consistent, and the interpretations of the standards are the same, whether it's being done by a senior constable outside Burke or by a roadside specialist road agency vehicle inspector at a checking station in New South Wales, that there's a consistent approach. And critically for us, that this didn't result in an enormous jump in costs either to the industry or to the governments. One thing we recognised from the outset was that there are operators out there in all sectors of the heavy vehicle industry, from the hire and reward to dedicated fleets, tankers, buses, freight vehicles, who are able to maintain their vehicles in a roadworthy condition, aren't being detected with defects at the roadside, and are still able to stay in business and be profitable. And we didn't want to be making any recommendations that required them to do any more than they were doing now. What we did want to make sure was that those operators who weren't maintaining their vehicle in good condition were brought up to that standard of the best in the industry, rather than just thinking that theirs was the only way to go. So we've put out two reports so far on the project. The phase one was really just a snapshot of what's actually going on around Australia at the moment, together with a survey of how the issue is managed in New Zealand, the US, Europe and the UK. Compare the different approaches, but really a factual document to lay out how things currently were. The phase two report was a much more critical survey, and that identified 38 areas where there were opportunities to improve the way things were currently done. And that ranged from training for mechanics and enforcement officers through to providing an actual definition of roadworthiness in the heavy vehicle law, which doesn't currently exist. You'll see there that it was open for public submissions until last Friday. The next step that we're taking with this report is on the feedback we've had so far, which has included feedback from the bus industry, some aspects of the bus industry and bus manufacturers, is to develop a regulatory impact statement which will go out for public consultation between the middle of January and the middle of March next year. So there will be an opportunity then to provide comments on some very specific recommendations rather than the much broader suite of areas that we think there's possibility for improvement. Just to illustrate the thinking we've had around the roadworthiness regime we've got at the moment, this might be a little difficult to read from the back of the hall. We'll just see if my little laser light is going to point. It's not, so watch the air hostess hand signals. Essentially, in order to get from a heavy vehicle to a defective vehicle, every operator of a vehicle, whether it's a truck, whether it's a bus, has various steps they can take as defences against their vehicle becoming unroadworthy. There's the procuring a good vehicle in the first place, procuring the right replacement parts of sufficient quality, the services of a mechanic who actually knows what they're doing to maintain the vehicle. There's the daily checks that you might ask your drivers to do, or a safety manager or a yard manager on the vehicles before they go out. It has been put to us by some bus industry people that they have the advantage that there's 20 or 30 people sitting behind the driver who are all too happy to point out if something's making a loud noise or smoke's emerging from where it shouldn't to provide early warning of a problem. the maintenance process that you've got in place, and for the most effective operators in this space, some form of checking to make sure that you're not just doing a maintenance process, but it's actually delivering the outcome of the vehicles being kept in roadworthy condition. On the other side, the right-hand side of the diagram, those green bars are the things that are being done largely by or on behalf of governments to detect a defective vehicle if it's found its way onto the road. If all of those things on the left have failed and the vehicle with a defect has got out there, or if a vehicle's developed a defect while it's actually out in service. So that's the periodic inspections, the annual or 6-monthly inspections that are required under state legislation. The enforcement activities, random inspections, targeted inspections where there's concern with an industry or a company or the historic record. And should we go down the path, chain of responsibility investigations. And then the grey bar down the bottom is the accreditation schemes, which are essentially there for a number of reasons. Firstly, in the NHVAS space for trucks, if you're in that accreditation scheme, you get a free pass from the annual inspection requirement, which is perhaps giving up too much for too little, as things currently are. Then there's also the reassurance to customers that an accredited vehicle is more likely to be in a roadworthy condition. They can be confident in choosing to use the supplier of that vehicle that they're going to be roadworthy. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, for an operator who is doing their best to maintain their vehicle in a good roadworthy working condition, the auditing process for an accreditation scheme should be providing them with information as to whether or not that's working and if there are any improvements that need to be made to maintain their vehicles in good condition. So that's, as I say, basically the way we've been thinking. The sort of opportunities we've identified that aren't currently there at the moment are the need for a clear statement of what roadworthiness actually is in the National Heavy Vehicle Law. At the moment, it's a little vague in that you must maintain your vehicle to meet all vehicle standards at all times. Nothing proactive about that, it's just an offence you can be charged with if the vehicle has been found to be defective when it's out on the road. So providing a positive requirement there would certainly clarify what we're looking for and remove some of the elements of interpretation about which of those vehicle standards actually are relevant to roadworthy condition. Better information, education and training has come to us from, as it often does, from all sectors that we've spoken to. The point was made to us by the head of a maintenance workshop for a heavy vehicle operator, a heavy freight vehicle operator, that his mechanics were expert at fixing faults if they'd been identified. They weren't expert at looking at a vehicle and saying what might be wrong with it. That was a different skill set. And it's one that the vehicle inspectors from the states absolutely agreed with. So we're looking at how you get that information of what you need to look at, what the early warning signs are to detect some of those defects that are going to be problems. And a common understanding across the states and territories and across those responsible for maintaining and enforcing the standards of vehicles. Chain of responsibility and maintenance is something that's been of interest for some time. The challenge with that is finding what the actual responsibilities are to put on each party. There is no doubt that just giving a defect notice to a driver isn't an effective way of dealing with the maintenance standards of a vehicle and a vehicle fleet, nor is just doing it to the company that's operating the vehicle. So we are looking at ways to extend that to cover those whose decisions have an influence on whether the vehicle takes the road in an unroadworthy or properly maintained state, including within a company that where a decision to, say, reduce the maintenance budget has led to a drop-off in the roadworthiness of the vehicles under consideration. Standardised inspection systems, I said at the start that there is a difference between what you can get with some very high technology roller shaker brake testers on the side of the road and a torch and a tape measure. Both those sort of roadside inspections are still going to be going on, but some standardisation of what you can and can't detect with each one and a differentiation between the expectations of how they're applied. So that we're not comparing apples with grapefruit when when looking at different states or even different parts of the same state report a certain level of defects. Improvements to accreditation or safety management systems, and I think perhaps safety management systems there rather than accreditation is the relevant one. Accreditation affects a very large proportion of the bus operators around Australia, but quite a small proportion of the freight transporters. But finding the way to get a broader uptake of those safety management system requirements so it leads to a greater overall inspection, overall standard of roadworthiness, including beefing up the audit requirements so they'd include an actual inspection of some vehicles to verify the reality of what the paperwork is telling the auditor is something which is definitely on the cards. And finally, establishing a nationally consistent network and strategy for monitoring the fleet and for deploying the resources to inspect and detect vehicles that are most likely at the greatest risk of having defects, the greatest risk of having catastrophes if a defect's present in a vehicle. Where we're at the moment, I said is we've got some recommendations that we'll be putting up to ministers in November, including the options that we propose to go out for public consultation in January, and there'll be opportunity for some consultation for the 2 months between mid-January to mid-March on those options. Just finally, I mentioned one other project that was at this time last year at the Adelaide conference was just about to get off the ground. Put out a discussion paper in February of 2014 about increasing the limit for two-axle buses from 16 to 18 tonnes. Feedback from that was essentially no major objections from any of the states or territories, although there was some degree of variance on what sort of conditions should be in place to allow that to happen. We've been working with the Heavy Vehicle Regulator and with Michael and the Bus Industry Confederation about what set of conditions would most suitably be able to be applied consistently around Australia, and have decided at this stage the best way to advance this is through notices issued by the Heavy Vehicle Regulator as each state falls into line. Then once we've got the agreement on the exact conditions, we can follow that up with regulation. But that allows things to happen and progress before we've got unanimous agreement, which is always takes longer to obtain than one would expect. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and hand over to Michael.
Thanks, Jeff. Our next speaker is Tim Hanson. Tim's the Principal Advisor to the CEO of the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator. He's worked with the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator since it began as a project in 2010 and actually was the inaugural Bus Industry Relationship Manager as part of the Bus Industry Task Force, which the BIC established to make sure that in the work that the NHVR was undertaking, they clearly differentiated between the regulatory issues that related to buses and separated them distinctly from trucks. Tim's here today to provide an update on a range of issues that the NHVR is currently working on in regard to our industry. Tim.
Good afternoon, and thanks very much for having us as part of the program today. As Michael mentioned, some of the work that we've been doing over the last 12 months, it's been interesting when you have a milestone like an annual conference, you look back to what happened last year, what was meant to happen in the ensuing year, and how much of it did. It's probably a mixed report card, but there's been certainly some progress, and I'll touch on some of those as we go through. Probably the big difference is that for the first time in Australia's history, since your last conference in February this year, a heavy vehicle national law was introduced, and what that means is that for the first time in Australia's history, you've got exactly the same words on the one statute that's applied in the participating states and territories, not their own previous interpretations of it. So it's like the source of the legislative river, if you like, that if you have inconsistent words, then inevitably you're going to get inconsistency at the roadside, which is not what you want. So we're keen to make sure that we go about our business in a way that improves your business, and our brief is really to facilitate, innovate and regulate. And some of the initiatives that we've got in place to give us some certainty to do that have been the approval of the budget for 2014 and 15. As Michael said in his opening remarks, both the National Transport Commission and ourselves are reliant on federal and state governments for funding. Progressively, when there's a national registration scheme, there'd be an ongoing source of funding for the national regulator from that, but that I'll speak to that in a moment later on. So we're looking to build a whole of organisations functions to deliver on that brief of productivity, efficiency and safety as well. I'll turn to some of the specific measures here now. Fatigue management is one that has a lot of interest to you. Advanced fatigue management, there are a number of bus operators in our advanced fatigue management option. We'd certainly like more. So what we're doing to try and get that, make it more appealing, is that we're taking steps to make that more accessible and also more effective. So what we recently did, because the accreditation arrangements for those bus operators and truck operators, but also anyone in the advanced fatigue management scheme, have an expiry date. So we recently contacted those people and have commenced working with those participants, assessing documents, and in some cases visiting operators at their depots to better understand how things work at the practical level. These operators have not been compelled into making major changes to their business just to meet the new AFM arrangements. And in the assessments that we've done to date, the operators have been able to show how their day-to-day business practices protect their drivers from fatigue. Probably the big change that we're in the process of doing now, there'll be a suite of these eventually, and the first one will be rolled out later this year, is a series of templates. So rather than you as individual operators needing to engage a fatigue management expert consultant that might cost you tens of thousands of dollars to find out whether you can or can't put something in place, if there's a template available on our website, then you can quickly assess whether it's worth you making that sort of investment in your business, whether you can do your own business assessment as to whether you're going to get the flexibility that you need for your business. So those tailored solutions, that means that anyone who signs up for those will be signing up for the highest level of training and fatigue management to get that done. Another building block in that fatigue management space is the Fatigue Expert Reference Group. So that has recently been refreshed, and there'll be some new appointments made to that there. And it's going to provide the basis for decisions from the previous committee of government representatives who were given the difficult job of trying to make determinations upon fatigue management issues and trying to determine what kind of management system an operator should be asked to have. So that's the fatigue management side of thing there. The next one on work diaries, I can tell you that we're making progress with a request for flexibility from BIC and your state associations on the requirement to complete a work diary, and we've sought additional detailed information needed to advance that request. So we're planning some changes to how we manage work diary exemptions, and during the internal review of our processes, we're not currently progressing any new work diary exemptions. We're focusing on getting things right so that when we do them, it'll be better for your businesses. So there's when the review is complete and the requested information comes back from BIC, then we'll be able to consult further on the likely timetable for a decision there. And I should emphasise as well that that's a piece of work, like much of the work that Jeff spoke to, where there's some joint cooperation between ourselves and the National Transport Commission. Rounding off rest breaks is a sometimes sensitive issue in terms of the completion of work diaries. At the last meeting of Transport Ministers in May, it was decided to put on hold any work on that matter and asked the National Transport Commission to develop a plan to gather some data on that. So Marcus, I think we'll touch on that a little bit later on. There was a business case on this presented to the recent meeting of chief executives only a few weeks ago for that data project, and that's really the next step in that work. Counting time, that's one of those ones as well that there have been differences over time. But depending where that one's at is depending on the progress and the outcomes of the joint project between ourselves and the NTC. A paper may be put to chief executives and ministers recommending that the law be amended to clarify that a relevant major rest break means the longest continuous rest break required in a given period for each work and rest hours module. So that's going to give you some clarity compared to what you have now. So, and that will most likely, if that does get approval, be put onto the work program for maintenance. Emergency and unplanned services. The short story with those ones there is that after that was endorsed by ministers a few years back as a medium-term priority, potential harmonisation of that is certainly the long-term goal, but jurisdictions continue to debate the possibility of making how those arrangements might work. But what we've done is the arrangements that did exist prior to the heavy vehicle law coming in New South Wales and Victoria, they have been preserved under a notice, and other jurisdictions are pretty much working through what arrangements they may have. I'll just turn to performance-based standards now. This one, it's certainly a potential solution to opening up a lot of the road network access to more buses. The applications are growing. I guess the short message that I'd like to leave with you on performance-based standards today is that while there was, and it's still on our agenda to undertake a review of the performance-based standards rules from the perspective of making them more accessible for buses, while that work is yet to progress, I had a look at the numbers. So since we took on this function in early 2013, there's actually been 12 bus designs approved, which has actually led to 43 PBS buses being put into service. So there's certainly some progress there as well. The project brief is on the blocks, just awaiting funding. We've got some input from BIC, and thank you, Michael, for your contribution to that. The issue, the other way where PBS could be a potential opener to get broader access is on some of those issues, such as the 2.55 metre wide buses. So it's a potential pathway there. There's a vehicle that's going through the PBS assessment there at the moment. So, but it's part of the larger issue around wider buses being built and their desirability and applicability in Australia. So our position at the moment is that anyone who wants to put an application forward for a PBS for a bus that fits outside of the vehicle standards dimensions, we'll assess that on its merits on a case-by-case basis. So the other part of that, of course, is any performance-based standards access that's opened up. It's to a defined access area. It's not general access. So we want to get. What we're doing at the moment is we want to get the legislative mechanism by which we bring that into place set and done in a modular way, so that when a design is approved, rather than operators having to go back to square one and apply for each access on its case, we'll have laid the groundwork for that in a modular way, and that's what we're doing now. And we're working closely with BIC on what sort of mechanism. It's the wiring, if you like, for what benefits you might get in practical effect down the track. And we're working very closely with BIC on that one. Mass and loading, I know that Jeff touched on that there, so there's really no more that I can add. I had it in my slides because it's a joint piece of work there. So that one, consultation is continuing with BIC, and ultimately we want to get to a place where we have harmonised arrangements across the country. That's certainly our goal. On compliance and enforcement, I'll turn this one around a little bit there. Our budget is $135 million a year, of which about 70% is spent on compliance and enforcement, so the services that states and territories provide for us. So it sort of puts it in perspective when you look at that there. So to swing those dot points around, what do we do with that money? Well, the focus is on strategic management, getting consistency, effectiveness, risk targeting, enforcement services that effectively give you the same treatment no matter what the circumstances. And that's a journey. As Jeff hinted in his presentation, some of the magic and mystery of the Federation can sometimes be a frustration for us as well as yourselves, but we're very focused on getting as much consistency as possible. So should move on to the next one now. Vehicle inspections. In terms of what our brief is, those 3 dot points at the top there kind of clarify that. So we look after and are responsible for what's inspected, how and where inspections will be conducted, and also monitoring the inspection outcomes in line with the prescribed vehicle standards. There's 2 core pieces of work that we're doing within that brief at the moment that I'll just touch on. The first one to do with competency of people conducting a heavy vehicle inspection, that the NHVR has agreement at officer level across the states and territories to adopt the National Heavy Vehicle Inspection Manual from March next year. So that interfaces, as Jeff suggested, with the roadworthiness standards as well. So once that's, the next step is to gain endorsement of that at a senior level, and once we achieve that, then we'll lay the groundwork for introducing that, and including communication with industry on what that might mean there too. That manual is used in accordance with the individual inspection regimes, so that they differ more for heavy vehicles, because I know under the passenger transport legislation that you have that there are the 6 monthly requirements and such that, as Jeff said, the truck sector does not have that. But the other one is on the roadworthiness program. I won't talk on that because Jeff's covered that quite extensively. Registration, as I mentioned, the heavy vehicle law provides for a registration scheme. The simple part is that those provisions haven't been switched on yet, and ministers are yet to decide when that will happen. But that sets up certainty for us to keep delivering consistency for you. That's really what it comes down to. Until that time, the states and territories continue to administer the registration schemes as they always have. So there's no change there for the moment. Heavy vehicle access, just to let you know where things are at with that. That's a part of our business that didn't go so well, I'll be honest, when the law was switched on in February this year. But there's a dedicated remediation program in place to set that right, with a focus on building some stable long-term permitting functions there. And the various elements of that you can see before you. I won't read them out, but there's very specific elements of that are starting to turn around and stabilise that part of the business. So that's going a lot better than it was as well. There's some work with the states and territories I should acknowledge as well there, that cooperation has helped a lot to get that stabilised. The way that that's structured at the moment is that the issue of those permits is done by a delegation under the law. So for intrastate trips, those applications are lodged with the relevant state authority. How am I going for time, Michael? All good? Yep. Okay. Yep. Okay. I'll skip over these ones here. That's just a graphic that gives you a good summary of the timeline that we've got there. In the interest of time, I'll move on, but that's just a summary there. So you can see the ministers' meeting coming up in November is a big one for certainly a progress report as to where the business case is at. That's just more. Skip over that. This is just a bit of an indication of the sort of thing that we're starting to do is within each state. That's an example of New South Wales, obviously, where we can map the density of the applications that we see for the various access permits that we get. Where that's helpful, you might wonder what's the big deal with that. Well, essentially what it does is help us to know where the business demand is, so that we can then use that to inform infrastructure bids and remove bottlenecks on the road network. That's essentially what it comes down with. Some of the areas that we're working with the states and territories on as well, broadly across our business: compliance, data sharing, accreditation, Pre-approvals, that's with local governments particularly, given that that's often, where when you drive out the gate of your depot, that's more than likely going to be a local government road. So we've had great success, in fact almost nearly 500 pre-approval and gazette requests that mean that when a permit application comes in, it gets turned around faster. So that's a good part of the work as well. Going forward, just 2 quick slides on this, is growing the capability across the organisation, continual improvement to facilitate, innovate and regulate, so the adventurous as well as the bread and butter, to deliver on that access remediation program, which, as those slides said, would, from once it's endorsed, maybe 12 to 18 months to get that properly. And some of the other initiatives as well with compliance and enforcement priorities to grow that part of the business, and keep engaging and keep talking to you through events like this and ongoing out of session as well. And that's it.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. There's a lot of work that's gone into all of those issues that Tim raised. They were all put on the table by the Bus Industry Task Force, which is made up of a couple of the executive directors and some of the people on our council. I may try and actually take you through some of those issues in a little bit more detail if I get the opportunity over the coming days. I guess the one thing I'd say, it's actually been a frustrating process for the industry because of the lack of progress or the slow progress with those issues, but we've just got to stick to our guns. The reality is getting the states together is like herding cats. They all support national uniformity and consistency as long as it's their model that's adopted. So that's part of our challenge, and we need to work with the NHVR to negotiate those outcomes with the states as well. Our next speaker is Marcus Burke. Marcus is the Project Director of Heavy Vehicle Compliance and Technology at the National Transport Commission. There's a lot of work going on in this area about how technology might support better, more accurate enforcement on the road and within your own company. So I'll invite Marcus to provide his presentation.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks for having me here. I hope you're all enjoying the conference. My name's Marcus Burke. I'm a Project Director at the National Transport Commission, and I'm going to talk about 3 of our technology projects that we've been working on over the last year or 2. Cooperative Intelligent Transport Systems, which I'll explain what that means, is some quite interesting new technology coming through over the next 2 or 3 years. Some work we've been doing on enabling the use of electronic work diaries as an alternative to the written work diary for those drivers who are required to fill one out, and some broader work around regulatory telematics, which I'll go through as well. Cooperative Intelligent Transport System. So what is it? The easiest way to explain is, as was stated by the former US Transportation Secretary, who said that cars talking to each other is the future of motor safety. But it's actually not just about cars, and it's not just about safety. What this is a platform that's being developed internationally to allow different elements of the transport network, cars, buses, trains, trams, as well as the infrastructure, roadworks, lights, etc., to share information in order to improve safety, productivity, environmental outcomes. So that all sounds good, but what does it actually mean? Well, as a practical example, the picture down there shows 2 cars approaching an intersection where perhaps their visibility is interrupted. If those cars were able to actually share data on where they are, how fast they're going, where they're heading, then that can allow the vehicle to actually warn a driver of an impending collision, even when they can't actually see the other car coming, and when other systems may not be able to, such as radars, may not be able to warn them. So this is a technology, it's similar to Wi-Fi, to allow the sharing of information, and once established, it'll be a platform that can potentially be used for a whole range of applications, not just around safety. So a number of the applications are based on the idea of the vehicle having a heartbeat, so that they'll actually broadcast around 10 times a second, the location, speed, direction, some of the other key information, such as what type of vehicle it is it a bus or a car, and things like whether the brakes are being applied. What that will allow is for other vehicles on the road to have greater awareness of vehicles around them and what's going on. in order primarily to avoid collisions, but also to do things like improving traffic flows. So you can have information being exchanged between traffic lights and vehicles, for example, to allow light signalling to become more dynamic based on the flows of traffic, and that can be extended to areas such as giving priority to buses and other forms of public transport. Similarly, you could have traffic lights actually sending out information to vehicles, for example, to provide them with the speed that they need to go at in order to get the next green light, so that you can have traffic flowing more smoothly rather than starting and stopping. So again, this is a platform which is under development, which potentially has a whole range of quite significant uses for all parts of the transport industry. So when are we likely to see it? The US has announced that, they announced back in March, plans to make these cooperative ITS devices mandatory in new light vehicles. They haven't given a time frame at this point, and they'll make a decision early next year on heavy vehicles. So that's going to be several years away before it actually does become mandatory for new vehicles, but that's obviously going to have quite a big effect on the market once that comes into place in the United States. And GM in the US has just recently announced that their new model Cadillac, coming out in late 2016, will be the first to actually have this technology in it to allow information to be shared between vehicles. So that's quite a significant step as well. So it is still a couple of years away, but this kind of technology will begin to come up as you look at purchasing decisions over the next few years. Just a couple of examples of where it's been trialled in Australia. There have been trials around using this at level crossings to give people warnings. Could be particularly useful across rural areas where you have crossings without boom gates and bells. There's a trial shortly to start around Port Kembla in New South Wales, focused on trucks, and a strip of road between the Hume Highway and the port, to try and do things like improving the flows of traffic, but also a number of safety applications. There's a series of pieces of work going on in Australia to try and enable this technology to be used. Some important work being done by Austroads on standards in particular, which is important to ensure that a European bus can talk to an Australian-made bus, and that they both can talk to a tram and to a car. So some of that standards work is quite important. The National Transport Commission has been doing some work to look at the policy issues raised, to ensure that there's no artificial barriers to this technology, which can potentially be very beneficial, as well as looking at any risks that need to be managed. I won't go through all the details of those, but probably the major issue that was raised was around privacy, and there's a number of recommendations in there to ensure that the privacy of drivers is appropriately protected, because there were fears that if you're broadcasting information as you drive around the network, that could then become a tracking device. So I'll jump from that to talking about electronic work diaries. So electronic work diaries are an alternative that's being developed to the current written work diary, the current logbook that many drivers have to fill out. I'm conscious there's different issues for the bus industry than there are for heavy vehicle drivers, and Tim mentioned some of the work going on around exemptions and those sorts of things. But what this project is intended to do is not change the law, but provide an alternative method to make it easier for drivers and for operators. So an electronic work diary, which would be a telematics device sitting in the vehicle, which allows the driver to enter their work and rest times, provides a range of benefits both for the driver in terms of helping them with their compliance, giving them warnings about when rest breaks are due, taking away from them some of the arithmetic that they need to do in their head. For operators, in providing some more efficiency around the management of the records, and then obviously for regulators in ensuring greater compliance. They will be a voluntary alternative, so drivers and operators who are required to do so can choose to continue to use a written work diary, or they can choose to use an approved electronic work diary. And I should say here the NHVR are working on the operational implementation of electronic work diaries, so looking at things like the approval process, training for enforcement officers and systems that need to be set up, etc. The NTC did quite a bit of work looking at, again, the policy issues that are raised by moving from written to electronic records, looking at the current provisions of the Heavy Vehicle National Law, privacy and surveillance issues, again, as well as compliance and enforcement issues. Those recommendations were approved by ministers in May, and we're now in the process of implementing the changes to the legislation. You can have a look on our website at the report, but some of the key recommendations, updating legislation to support a cloud-based model for records, rather than, for example, having a printer in the cab to actually hand the records over to an enforcement officer to examine. Improve protection of driver records to ensure that those records can only be accessed for legitimate purposes and only used for restricted purposes under the law, and also clarifying the enforcement approach, particularly around the small breaches that could be found in an electronic diary that would likely not be found in a written record. Finally, just on telematics, excuse me, we've been doing some broader work looking at telematics applications and how we can better enable future applications to be developed. In Australia, we've currently got the Intelligent Access Program as an existing telematics excuse me, application for regulatory purposes. We've got an emerging application in electronic work diaries, but there's a series of other potential ones that have been raised, from things like better tracking of dangerous goods, to speed management, to broader access or mass management, or indeed roadworthiness, that you could use telematics devices to better track the condition of the vehicle. So what we've done is taken a step back and look at what are the principles that we need to have in place for any new applications, and also in conjunction with Transport Certification Australia to develop a data dictionary to ensure that we support interoperability and the one device to potentially be used for a range of different applications, rather than having things defined in different ways for different purposes. So that's everything I wanted to cover today. Again, just as key messages, that there's emerging opportunities to utilise technology to improve safety and productivity, but there's a need for appropriate policy to support and not hinder that. Privacy and liability are key topics which come up with each of these, and industry can certainly assist us by continuing to provide input, and we certainly encourage you to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank Marcus. Marcus, I know you shortened it, but it's a good summary of some of that stuff that's going on in that space, which is going to see significant changes in the way you can and choose to do things into the future. I'd like to move straight on to the next session, and whilst Stephen Lucas and Professor Graham Currie make their way up, if there's any urgent questions, we'll quickly take one. But other than that, I can't see any hands out there, so we might move on to the next session. This topic actually that we've heard, I was thinking listening to it, probably deserves actually a dedicated day in its own right to actually take industry through all of the things that are going on. Graham, you can make your way up. Thank you to our three speakers, and we'll move straight into the next session. Stephen.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for your attendance. This is our final session on the Monday plenary program, and thanks again to the previous session sponsors, the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator, who are also partners with us in the Australian Bus and Coach National Conference and Expo. A bit of housekeeping before we start. Delegates should be advised that the Mercedes-Benz dinner tonight will be held in this room here at 7 p.m. The dress is smart casual for the evening. This session is research focused and tells us what the research says about bus safety, bus accidents and bus priority. Our sponsor for this session is Multi-Spares, who are strong supporters of the industry and the BIC. As I've said before, the BIC's advocacy is built around evidence-based policy, and the evidence part of this comes from a strong research agenda. This comes from within BIC through the Secretariat and the work we do with academic bodies. Our speaker this afternoon is Professor Graham Currie, who will present on the safety co-benefits of building bus rapid transit and bus priority. As you know, bus is already the safest form of road transport, but investment in bus priority and BRT brings with it many more benefits than just a faster trip for the passengers. This is something for all governments to take into account when looking at infrastructure projects and investment. Professor Currie has been a big contributor to the BIC's advocacy message through the work he has done at Monash University. After his presentation, I'll follow up with an update on the work that BIC has been undertaking in relation to the analysis of fatal bus accidents. We'll then move to questions if time permits, and please welcome Professor Graham Currie.
G'day. So I understand I'm keeping you between now and a beer, so I better hurry up, eh? But this is about some research we've been doing about bus safety. It's a bit of a story, and it didn't start off where we expected and didn't finish where we expected, which is something that's good about research. We started exploring factors affecting bus risk in a bus company, and it expanded into new and really groundbreaking areas. I can say groundbreaking. My definition of groundbreaking is when I'm invited to an international conference to talk about it, whether they'll pay for my flight or not. So there's plenty of that been happening recently because people are quite astounded by some of the findings we came out with, because it really affects the whole case of whether bus priority is a good thing in cities. We've published this an awful lot in the top leading journals. They're very hard to get into. I'll tell you the story, though, as we go along. It's part of a much wider research programme funded by the Australian Research Council. It's part funded by Vic Roads and Public Transport Victoria. And we were looking at ways to improve methodologies to build bus priority systems, including their wider effects. And it all started with a key question about whether safety was affected by bus priority. So I'll talk in the order in which it all happened. Firstly, we started looking at bus accident risks, and then we asked, well, bus routes with and without priority, how do they perform? And then we started asking bigger questions. Well, how does road safety affected by bus priority? And we did a lot of investigations to explore why the effects we found were happening. So we started with Grenda Bus Company offering to give us their traffic incident management system. So we did a classic study just trying to understand what factors affected the safety of a bus company. And these are bus accidents. In fact, they're a special type of bus accidents, what's called at-fault bus accidents. And we used a classic process of looking at driver-related factors, roadway-related factors, and vehicle factors that might affect these. And we investigated this database to explore which ones were important. We found 2 key vehicle factors and 5 road environment factors which were significant. And they include bus priority as one of the major factors. Yeah, I don't know if you can see that, but these parameters here are the ones that are the biggest influences, and the highest numbers are the biggest influence. And as you can see, the highest numbers here are for bus priority. And what we found is that, in fact, I've got a ranking at the side here, the factors, the 1 to 5. The single biggest factor that acts to reduce road accidents that are at fault from the bus driver is bus priority, followed by whether the road is divided or not. And in fact, non-divided roads and slower speeds are more at-risk factors for buses than the opposite. A bit different from other traffic, and we think that's to do with manoeuvring of the vehicle in tight spaces. We also found that bus age, older buses and longer buses, were more dangerous or had higher risk factors. Other things we found, and so the key things really were bus priority and non-divided roads. And in fact, of them all, bus priority was the biggest factor. We also looked at driver-related factors. We found that older drivers above 60, we think driver skills, drivers with less than 2 years skills. We did find a significant factor suggesting that male drivers were safer, although it wasn't a big effect. We also found that people that had a previous at-fault accident rate were more likely to have accidents in the future. But of all of them, the biggest factor was bus priority, which led us to begin to ask questions about bus priority. Why was it safer, and what was the effect? Why was it happening? Which led us to actually look at the data again and whether we could predict bus accident rates for different types of bus routes. So we took the Grenda data again, and we asked what was the performance of bus routes and sections of bus routes with priority and not priority, where instead of causal factors, we're just looking at differences between the different types of route sections. The original data, and you see two sets of data here, is we've got lots of different types of accidents. The red is sections with bus priority, and the blue is sections without. And what it showed very clearly is a 70% reduction in accidents with buses hitting stationary objects if you had bus priority. It sounds obvious that you're not going to be in the traffic stream. 80% reduction in buses hitting stationary vehicles. 80% reduction in collisions in and out of bus stops, because, of course, you're not in the traffic stream anymore. And we were basically suggesting that bus priority facilitates bus movements on roads with traffic for obvious reasons. So we went through lots of steps of analysis, and we're able to predict the factors influencing the degree of risk. But the first outcome was quite an amazing one. And what it suggested was that the presence of bus priority in a bus route reduces the accident rate by 54%. Okay, that's a huge number. We are also able to establish the types of things that were influencing accident rates: traffic volume, high volume, stop density, where there's more stops, you're coming in and out of them more often, and also the frequency of service. The more frequency you have, the greater exposure. And we were able to create these, what are called exposure planes, which show the differences. Here we have the traffic volume, and we have the stop density, and here's the accident rates. And you can see the higher rates are at the top end of the graph. And you can see that, you get the highest accident rates at higher volume with higher stop density. And the other maps here show other aspects of all of that using different metrics, which is quite a level of degree of certainty. We can predict the types of accidents that occur. Well, we then moved on to ask a completely different question. This is all very interesting for bus accidents, but what about all the other traffic? Do they have any influence? And this is where the groundbreaking element came in. We were very fortunate. My whole career is a great big huge accidental. I'm not planning it, it just sort of seems to happen. I live in a city where we put the biggest amount of bus priority into a city in a shortest space of time we have ever known. This is the Smart Bus network, which is now bigger than Melbourne's tram network. And we've had a huge influx of bus priority, and we were able to mine this to explore the before and after effects on all traffic. The types of treatments were space-based priority, which is bus lanes, and also intersection priority, usually queue jump lanes and traffic signal priority. So we looked before and after for a year of crash stats, and we found some quite amazing results. So amazing we really didn't believe it when we first looked at it. We found that all accidents on all roads, this is not just bus accidents, all traffic, had gone down by 18%. And in fact, the most important group of accidents, the fatal and serious accidents, had gone down 31%. That's a hugely dramatic change in the most important types of accidents. And indeed, fatal accidents, on average per annum, had gone down from 3 per annum to 0. We've saved 3 lives per annum because of bus priority on Smart Bus. Now, if you know anything about the economics of road safety, these benefits are far, far in excess of any costs associated with bus priority, or actually even any operational benefits, I would suggest. Anyway, we explored in further because, to be honest, the numbers were so big, we really had to ask ourselves, are they real? We went into some depth to explore accident types. You probably can't see the details in this, but I think you can see these are the total accidents and the fatal and serious accidents, of which the biggest ones there are to do with follow-on accidents. And they've all gone down. The green, the dark green is the after situation, and the light green is the before situation. And the biggest group of accidents is the follow-on accidents. These are rear-end accidents of cars hitting each other. It's not just cars hitting buses, cars hitting each other, and also merge accidents. In fact, we were able from this to start hypothesizing why bus priority is having this effect. And this started a whole stream of work exploring this and trying to discover why these effects were occurring, because, of course, if you can understand them, you can try and replicate them. Well, we had a 66%, yes, that's a huge number, drop in off-road, off-path accidents, where cars steer off the road and hit something on the curbside. We would theorise that the bus lane is acting as a buffer so that someone can make a mistake but still recover. We had a 50%, yes, a halving of all accidents where cars hit each other at a 90-degree angle. And these are cars merging from the side road. And again, we hypothesised that the bus lane is acting as a buffer. Now, the bus lane is not full of buses all the time. You know, the best frequencies we've got are 6 or something buses an hour. So the bus lane is really empty most of the time for traffic. And this is why we're getting this effect. In fact, interestingly, for those of you that might know about the debate of motorcycles and bus lanes in Victoria, is we established that there were far more reductions in motorcycle accidents, usually from these side accidents, when the cycles were outside of the bus lane, because of better line of sight for the vehicle emerging, because it's actually further away from the curbside and you get a better angle of seeing the vehicle, and of course you have a buffer. But the biggest margin of volume of accident reduction was rear-end accidents, typically cars hitting the back of each other as they slow down behind buses, or they try and nip out behind buses, which are, you know, slow vehicles like trucks. There was a 28% drop. It doesn't sound as big as the other ones, but the volume is actually the biggest volume. We also theorised at intersections there were better lines of sight because of queue jump lanes, meaning traffic could see each other better, and also the slower movement of traffic in some cases may be reducing accidents. We went through a lot of processes here. The work was done with Monash University Accident Research Centre and the team, and we had to allow for lots of trends that were occurring. So what we originally found in analytical methods we have to use was the 18% before and after effect was probably more like 14%. However, the fatal serious accidents had gone down tremendously. The same analysis established that bus lanes were having a bigger effect than intersection treatments. This led us to a whole series of investigations. I haven't got time to show you them all, but you might be interested in this one. This was an investigation about the rear-end accidents that were occurring and an exploration of whether bus lanes were reducing this and what factors were causing that. And we used what's called traffic microsimulation. Now, I'm sure you've all got smartphones and iPads and so forth, and your kids are all out there playing simulation games with aeroplanes, and you can even do a bus parking game, I think, these days. Well, these games are real with traffic flow modelling. And in fact, the traffic flow models just look like this. They look like visualizations, but they represent the actual behaviour of vehicles in time and space, and aspects of them can be used to try and represent how close vehicles get to each other and the types of manoeuvres that could be considered dangerous. And the great thing about it is it can be used as an experimental model to explore different configurations of roads, and that's what we wanted to explore in this analysis. Our purpose was really to try and explore the design of smart bus and whether it adapted to reduce the conflicts between cars that were dangerous. There were 3 configurations of road. Usually Melbourne roads where we have smart bus are 3-lane, and there have been 3-lane in the top there. That's the base case, if you like, before the treatment. The second one is the road, one lane of the road has been taken away for the bus lane, and the third one is we've added an extra lane, which is the bus lane. And we want to just test the 3 sets of configurations, or the 2 sets of configurations. Now, Monash, both my group at ITS, Institute of Transport Studies, and MUARC, the Accident Research Centre at Monash, have been specialising, we're sort of world specialists in use of what's called time-to-collision metrics, measures of micro-simulation models. And these things, what they measure is how close vehicles get to each other in time and space, and whether this can act to be a conflict which could cause an accident. And we do that through a lot of things like monitoring videos of traffic on roads and getting the type of dangerous behaviours we see to be replicated in these simulation models. You can't simulate everything, sorry, you probably can't see all that. You can't simulate a driver accidentally falling asleep in a simulation model, but you can simulate a lot of the other behaviours. Let me just show you some examples. Now, here we've got a series on the left of no bus priority treatments, and on the left, bus priority. At the top, we've got intersection treatments. If you look closely there, you can see with the no priority, you can see turning movements here of the vehicles. They're all interacting with each other here at the intersection. And here, with the bus lanes, there's much less interaction. And they get much closer, further away from each other because the bus lane actors are dispersing them. The bottom graphic is bus stops. And if you look closely, you can see here traffic behind the vehicle, the bus stopping, and it's trying to find a way out, and it'll nip out. And that can involve dangerous behaviours of the vehicles getting very close to each other, what we call a conflict. So we measured, under lots of different varying conditions, the performance of these 3 configurations. And what we have here is 2 sets of metrics here, and these are the number of conflicts. And the top line here is the base case, this configuration here without the bus lane, and same with this one. And that's the number of conflicts you get without any bus lanes. And the bottom lines are the 2 configurations B and C here. And what you see is a significantly lower volume of conflicts of vehicles between each other, which replicates to actually representing things like merge accidents and rear-ending accidents of vehicles. That's at intersections. This is at bus stops. And the key difference here, again we get less, is that this configuration here where you add another lane is actually much safer than this configuration where you just take one away. Suggesting that, adding more road space is safer. And I think we kind of all expected that. So what do we conclude from all this? A lot of work was done in a very short space of time, and some of it really should change world bus priority practice. We explored crash risks for bus companies. We found that the key factors reducing accidents were or increasing accidents was not having bus priority. Undivided roads were more risky, slower speeds, and also lighter traffic because the guard of drivers may be down. Nighttime, older buses, longer buses, very older drivers over 60, new drivers within the first 2 years of their work, women drivers slightly, and drivers with a crash history. Bus routes with priority have a 50% lower crash risk. Also, we found that all road traffic crash risk factors reduce significantly with bus priority. It reduces total crash risk by 14% for all traffic. All traffic has this effect, not just buses, and vehicle-to-vehicle crashes. Much larger reduction in fatal serious accidents, which is actually the king of this. And looking back on all this, we can argue we should be designing roads with bus lanes in it just for road safety. Not something we've ever really thought about before. But certainly on the list of reasons why we'd have bus priority, actually road safety could end up being at the top. So that concludes my work. I just wanted to point 2 things out for you. Those of you interested in research in buses and public transport, we offer a free website which costs me the cost of a saloon car every year to run. It's available for the entire world's industry. It's got all the research ever published in leading research journals on it. It's free to use. And if you put your website or your email address in that, we'll send you every 2 months all the new publications in public transport research. And also, if you're interested in the research group I am involved in, Institute of Transport Studies at Monash, we have a LinkedIn page, and it has small stories about the type of work we do. And if you're interested in joining us, or a Facebook page, please just link in with me whenever you're ready. Thank you.